If you look at the three big stages of how a developer essentially contributes to the business, there's everything that comes before the code, everything that comes during the code, and everything that comes after the code.
This is DevOps Paradox, episode number 186. Easily get your code to the cloud with Amnic. Welcome to DevOps Paradox. This is a podcast about random stuff in which we, Darren and Victor, pretend we know what we're talking about. Most of the time, we mask our ignorance by putting the word DevOps everywhere we can and mix it with random buzzwords like Kubernetes, serverless, CI/CD, team productivity, islands of happiness, and other fancy expressions that make us sound like we know what we're doing. Occasionally, we invite guests who do know something, but we do not do that often since they might make us look incompetent. The truth is out there, and there is no way we are going to find it. P.S. It's Darren reading this text and feeling embarrassed that Victor made me do it. Here are your hosts, Darren Pope and Victor Farsick. Recently I saw an article about devs don't want to do ops. I believe it was in InfoWorld or somewhere else. Victor, we talked about it one Friday.
Yeah.
Do you think that's still true?
Depends on the ops, right? A good example of devs do want to do ops is Docker. Docker was largely adopted by developers, right? I would even argue that today we have a problem that there is too big of an adoption of Docker, right? Which kind of blocks some other more production-friendly, let's say, ops. On the other hand, give a developer AWS and tell him you need to create internet gateway and subnets and VPCs and what's not, and he freaks out and says no ops, right? So it really depends on the level of ops, of type of ops, at least in my experience.
And on today's episode, we have Ankit on from Amnic. Ankit, how are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Darren. Doing well. Thank you for having me on the show.
Let's dig in a little bit more about devs not wanting to do ops. What do you see? Because on your website, you had a blog post that had sort of some content around this concept. If you want to sort of restate that, and we can talk back and forth about that.
Sounds great. I think if I look at the past decade and the way the DevOps ecosystem has evolved, the SRE ecosystem has evolved, it seems like a lot of onus of the setting up the environment, setting up the non-functional part of the developer, I'd say, setup has by default fallen onto the shoulders of developers. And I do believe that comes in the way of their productivity, that comes in the way of their flow of thinking. It definitely comes in the way of creating value for the business. Here's how I'd want to answer. Dev wants to do minimum ops, but there is ops dev has to do. The distinction is very important, and I believe that finding the right balance there is going to be the biggest value unlock for the developer ecosystem as a general.
What do you mean by minimum ops?
For example, I think shifting left some of the ops, let's say when it comes to security, when it comes to build time, let's say provenance, as you mentioned, Victor, are some of the ops that developers, if they intervene early and actually focus on it at the right time, it prevents a lot of iteration cycles. It prevents a lot of wastage of productivity. Those kind of ops where developer doing the ops actually creates a leverage for the rest of the development lifecycle is the ops that they should be doing and they essentially need to do. But what they shouldn't be doing or what they shouldn't be expected to do is do the ops, which is primarily hygiene, like setting up their environments, struggling with connecting to sort of your remote or local development environments, going back and forth on infra provisioning or going back and forth on, let's say, interdependencies or tribal knowledge for which they have to interrupt their natural workflows. So whatever is not the value add ops needs to be taken out of developers' plate so they can focus on some of the ops which is actually value generative and which actually creates a leverage for the rest of the team.
I kind of agree with what you said, but I think that kind of surfaces a problem, and that is that we have very limited ops services targeted at developers, when we talk about ops services, we are talking mostly about building blocks, right? I do agree with you, but partly because really companies do not have services that would enable developers to create, let's say, environment that you mentioned with a single click or a command or something like that. Not necessarily that they don't want to do that, because opening a Jira ticket to get something is a disruption as well, right? So we can look at it from two perspectives. Kind of, there is always a disruption. The question is whether we want a disruption in terms of I need to stop doing what I'm doing and figure this out, or disruption, I need to stop what I'm doing and wait until somebody else closes this Jira ticket that I requested something.
I agree with you. I'd actually extend it a bit further and say that it's not that developers don't have tools. I'd say that developers' tools are fragmented all along the ecosystem. If you look at, for example, if I have to debug, let's say, my application not starting up, is it because my local runtime is not working? Is it because my Kubernetes cluster is not working? My network connection is not working? Or is it that the secrets or the vaults or the configs that I want to pull out don't have the right access? Or is it that someone else's service is not working? Or is it that my CI, CD, somewhere else something is broken? All of this information lies in modules and lies in sort of pockets at different surface targets. I think it would be amazing for the developers to have the ability to quickly solve whatever they can themselves, or quickly delegate whatever is under someone else's purview. In that, the tools, I think the missing part is not the technical tools, but the product experience tools. And this is where sort of the platform engineering kind of a view comes in. And a lot of companies do spend a lot of resources internally to bring about that, I'd say, the visibility or sort of the easy way in which you can backtrack your workflow and block whatever disruption, or stop whatever disruption is blocking you and move ahead. I'd say the tools, and more importantly, the product experience around the tools, is the part which makes the ops part of ops very operational heavy.
Yeah, but that's in a way similar, like, let's say, AWS, right? There is operational knowledge that is beyond AWS users, like how hypervisors work. You, as me, as a AWS user, do not even have to know that there is such a thing as hypervisor, right? It's somebody else's problem to make sure that hypervisors are working. And it's my problem whether I know how to create a VM, which is higher level abstraction of that on top of that hypervisor, right? Is that more or less the direction you're talking about?
Exactly. I think there's a saying in engineering, no, there's no problem that cannot be solved with one more layer of abstraction. So this essentially the one place where you are bubbling up all the right information, but abstracting out the nitty-gritties of it, which are completely, I'd say, transactional handshakes between the lower part of the value chain, and that finding that right balance in the abstraction is the key to giving right power to the developers without taking away from them, without burdening them with a lot of, I'd say, Sherlock Holmes work.
You were mentioning a product experience. What do you think a good product experience is for a developer?
Let me compare the infrastructure and the pipeline product experience that a developer has versus the coding experience that a developer has, right? The first time I started coding, I was actually using SVN, and I was using Vim as my code editor, right? But in the last 15 years, as the developments have happened on GitHub, GitLab, the user space that got created on top of it, the integrated developer experience that came with the IDEs like VS Code, they essentially created that product experience, which became the sole point where a developer can go and reason with the code, investigate the code, or develop the code. So in the coding part of it, the experience that a developer has been a super, I'd say, positive product experience, right? And I'm not discounting the technology innovation that has happened in that, but the product innovation has also kept pace with it. With GitHub becoming the sole place where you could do anything with your code, it created that user space where developers could go and essentially find anything about their code base, be it what change got committed when, how do new changes get incorporated into the system, how are different let's say people collaborating and mutating that code base, and how he can be a part of that kind of a user experience. If you try to map it into the infrastructure space or into the environment space, that hasn't been created as of now. A developer's identity is fragmented among 15 different tools. There is IAM, but that only reasons with the AWS resources world of the access management. And then there is, let's say, your CI/CD, which is a different user, let's say, experience. Then all the other intermediaries that you have in between. Some of it is through a SaaS product or a UI. Some of it is through CLI. Some of it is essentially parsing logs. Some of it is like going through, some dashboards, metrics. So the experience that a developer has when he interacts with the infrastructure or the release part of his let's say technology stack versus when he interacts with the code base part of the experience, they are worlds apart. And I believe that this is where the product experience has been lagging, and this is where the whole genesis of developer productivity teams, internal productivity platform teams, internal developer platform teams came about, because they wanted to catch up on the product experience, not necessarily create the new technology innovation which can give them new capabilities or give them that marginally extra let's say edge. So this is what I mean by product experience.
I think it's interesting that the way that you called it out for app, call that VS Code, GitHub, and then the infra, where if you were working in an environment to where the people that have the keys to AWS, Azure, GCP didn't make it easy for you. Whereas all the other vendors, specifically Microsoft in this case, talking VS Code and GitHub, have made it very simple for you to actually get your code written, potentially get it packaged, but from that point forward, nobody's come up with a nice, clean way of managing it from that. And not even Microsoft makes it easy to get it into Azure.
Precisely. And if you look at sort of the three big, I'd say, stages of how a developer essentially contributes to the business, there's everything that comes before the code, everything that comes during the code, and everything that comes after the code. Before the code, if you look at sprints and all the project management and program management and product tools and the user space that has been created, that has made that developer experience go farther, and that has given a good handshake or a contract between, let's say, product orgs and development orgs. If you look at the code bases, the GitHub has done the same. But if you look at the everything that happens after the code, this is where we've had a lot of abstractions that have been created and a lot of silos that have been created, but they all are vertical experiences, which doesn't provide a horizontal end user consumable way in which a developer could reason with it.
We had things like Heroku, like for 15 years or something like that, right? And all those that came after that never caught up, right? The attempt is in a direction, if I understand right, that you're referring, right? Providing that horizontal experience. Yet Heroku and all similar services never really became a massive thing. I'm not going to say that they were not used, right? So what's missing there?
I think scalability. The experience really, really works when you are, let's say, a few people working on a front end, back end, and a database. But as soon as you go from like a few people to a larger team, you need multiple environments. As soon as you go from, let's say, a very simplistic front end, back end to microservices architecture, multi-services architecture, cloud hybrid architectures with Lambda functions, step functions, and all these new jam that is coming up, the experience just doesn't scale. And that's why Heroku, if you look at the business, they have a natural ceiling on their head. They have an adverse selection bias. The most successful of their customers will move out of Heroku because they will, at the end of the day, need to manage the complexity, which is part and parcel of product development in modern age.
But does it need to be? If you're creating a product that becomes so complex that you can't use Heroku, are you doing it wrong?
Not really.
I'm playing the other side.
I hear you.
I'm playing the other side of the coin here.
I hear you. See, I think the days when, let's say you were creating, let's say, a simple reservation website where you could have a front end which will give you a user experience, a back end which will interact with your database, and that's it. That kind of a product paradigm was really, really suited for Heroku kind of an experience. Unfortunately, now there is a lot of asynchronous processing that goes in. There's a lot of modularization that has to happen because you don't know which part of your business function would need to run at what pace, so you cannot work on monoliths anymore. So I'd say that the sophistication of product has got to a place where the simple monolith kind of a experience, or a simple front end back end kind of an experience, doesn't scale. What's the marginal utility of all the complications that have been created in along the way is, I'd guess, is a debate which is a completely, let's say, novel on its own. But if we are bound by the realities of how product needs to sort of have the behaviors and the characteristics today, you cannot get away with some level of I'd say modularization, some level of complication in the architectures. And because of those kind of complications, I'd say the simplistic view of front end back end database doesn't scale. Now I think the world is worse for that, not better for that, but we take the world as it is.
When you say scale, do you refer to literally scale or the diversity that comes with the scale?
When I say scale, I mean the number of users using your product. Essentially, as more and more people start to use your product, I think now this is where I don't that debate. It's a debatable part, but you will start to make your product more feature rich. You would have, let's say, some real time sort of engagement with your product. There'll be some sort of transactional experiences with the product. You'd want to do a lot of, let's say, analytics on top of it, or create some models behind it. Now, all of these extra functionalities, you might want to actually innovate on their user experience. You might want to provide a lot of third-party integrations, and then you might want to also integrate with a host of other SaaS services which you use today, be it your authentication provider like Auth0, your payment gateways. So essentially, because the interactions that your product will have beyond the key interaction, which is the end user, the behind the scenes interactions get complicated over time, and because of those complications, trying to contain it within sort of a simplistic architecture becomes hard. I do think that serverless is trying to go completely the other way, where it's essentially all those different interactions can just be sort of left to the serverless ecosystem, and the orchestration and the complexity of creating this whole pipeline will go away. But I guess that doesn't come without maybe its own challenges. Honestly, serverless is an area where I still haven't made my opinion. Does it make your life easier or harder? I'd say it's it's a complicated question. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it's very interesting discussion, because the interpretation of the, I'm going to call it, failure of Heroku-like solutions usually is attributed to them being highly opinionated. If I interpret right, your direction is not that much that highly vendor opinionated is a problem, but rather than the sheer amount of services offered by solutions like Heroku-like is the real issue, right? So kind of vendor opinionated. Am I interpreting it right if I say vendor opinionated is not an issue, but the scale of the amount of integrated services is really the issue that killed it?
I do think that modern product would have multiple inlets of integrations as well. You would need, like, let's say, a messaging queue. You would need a couple of services which are dedicated to talking to other third-party services. You would need some sort of, and if you spell that out, Heroku, the opinionated part is also partly a failure. I believe that the opinionated part is that for Heroku, one app is the universe for them. But as we know, as developers who interact with the environments, one app is just a unit. The key unit that a developer interacts with is a developer environment, or a staging environment, or a production environment. So in a way, I think this is the opinionated sort of box, which is one problem. Another problem is the extensibility. Because if you are moving away from a simplistic front end, back end kind of a universe, then you would want your apps to interact with your messaging queues, your sort of buckets, your other services, and then you would want to have all of this managed as an environmental unit.
I guess the potential issue could be that we have, or at least had in the past, extremely fragmented industry, right? We have Azure, we have AWS, we have Google Cloud, we have on-prem, and so on and so forth. And they have all completely different, nothing to do with each other APIs, right? So if I would like to create a type of a solution that we're discussing right now, I would almost certainly fail because simply the sheer amount of the differences is huge. Is that where maybe Kubernetes comes into play? Because we as industry are finally figuring out that, hey, that's your problem. Now we have an API that works, give or take, more or less the same, no matter what is below that API.
Exactly. I think what you had said would be completely true maybe like 3 or 4 years ago, where Kubernetes wasn't still the dominant factor. In my previous company, we actually started on Mesos Marathon, not even Kubernetes, right? Now with the Kubernetes and the CNCF ecosystem that has come about, I'd say the compute part is getting sorted very fast, be it in terms of what's the compute engine, what's the compute orchestration, what is the language that will sort of program your compute, and essentially every other intermediary service like service mesh or your container registries or your artifactories, all of them are becoming very standardized. And because of this sort of a change that has come about, I believe that now it is easier, but it's still easier in the compute part of the ecosystem. But if you look at the non-compute part of the ecosystem, I'd say it's, but honestly, if you are able to create a compute environment as a service, that itself is a huge way step up from where we are today.
Now that you mentioned the ecosystem, right, we are getting at least attempts, right, of that type of standardization, like open, what's the name? Not open metrics. My brain stopped now.
Telemetry.
Open telemetry.
Open telemetry, exactly, right? Could those types of standardizations help? Because at least in the future, if not today, with open telemetry, I can say, hey, this is how I expose metrics. This is how I consume metrics. I don't really care whether we're talking about CloudWatch or Datadog or Prometheus or what's or not.
Definitely. See, I think open telemetry is one example of it. Build packs is another example of it, which is like how do you convert a code base into containers, which is also part of CNCF, by the way. Then another part is just the OCI, OCR standards that have come about. How would an image be defined? How would an image be stored? Same is true when it comes to service mesh. So plenty of areas where I'd say all the steps that you would take to chart out the journey of code to cloud, each step is getting standardized in its totality. Even in provisioning with cloud development kits, there's a lot of emphasis on sort of making a standard way in which provisioning can happen. And then innovations like Terraforms that have definitely pushed that or accelerate that path. So yeah, I do believe that the developer ecosystem, the way it looks today versus a decade from now, will be as starkly different as how, for example, the compute world looked when it was data centers versus cloud. There is a huge value migration that will happen as this wave of changes starts to sediment into the developer's day-to-day life. Yeah, I believe that's the opportunity.
If it was not for Kubernetes, and even before you'd worked on Mesos, if those two things did not exist, where would we be today?
I think if Kubernetes was not there, we would be in the cloud provider's proprietary way of managing our containers. And that's the world which I think we would have gone to, because containerization did bring a new unit to reason with, which is your runtime in a box. Props to the team that behind Kubernetes, because Kubernetes is not just a platform, it's essentially a new paradigm that they've brought about. It's very extensible. It's an amazing piece of software. So yeah, without Kubernetes, I do believe that we might have gone to a more walled garden kind of compute, and ECS was well on its way to sort of create that service. But with Kubernetes coming in and especially getting adopted by all cloud providers, it has become that fundamental truth that people can bake into their solutioning and build on top of it, instead of trying to backport it to all the other variations that might be there. Miso's Marathon also tried it, but honestly, the market spoke, and the design of Kubernetes was far more elegant than Miso's Marathon.
Could we even say simpler? I can't believe I'm saying Kubernetes is simple, but
yeah, compared to
having
this,
worked with Mesos Marathon myself, yeah, it was. I mean, they each had their pluses and minuses.
No, I believe that the main issue was not necessarily whether Marathon was simpler or more complicated in Kubernetes, but rather that given different options like Mesos, Nomad, Docker, and Kubernetes, Kubernetes was the only option for other companies to invest in without being potentially held hostage by a single company, right? If you try to build the ecosystem that was built on top of Kubernetes for Docker or Mesos or Nomad, you would be at the mercy of the companies behind those, right? It wouldn't be much different than building an ecosystem on top of, let's say, AWS, which is great. A lot of companies are doing it and earning good money and so on and so forth, but they are at the mercy of AWS. I believe that that's the main reason that why Kubernetes skyrocketed in a way.
But as an interesting counter example, I would say Docker, right? Docker was that sort of proprietary solution which could have created similar issues as you are mentioning, but somehow the ecosystem navigated through it to create open standards on top of it. Now, I don't know if it is a replicable process or not, but it's definitely an interesting case study.
I wouldn't say that because, maybe if you mean Docker as Docker product, but then we saw what happened to Docker Swarm and other tools that were more geared towards production usage, right? Because Docker is really today limited to laptops, at least from my perspective. But Docker Swarm failed miserably. Docker Swarm was essentially Kubernetes.
Exactly, completely distributed, and it was, yeah. I think the elegance of Kubernetes as a solution just beat out all the other competitors.
I would actually say the elegance of Kubernetes as a solution to be extended by others. That's how I would kind of define it, right? Not necessarily for end users, because I tell people all the time, hey, you are still not experienced enough if you think that Kubernetes alone is solving your problems. The layers on top of it, like you mentioned, service meshes and this and that, basically all the things that you need to put on top of it solve your problem. But Kubernetes allows those things to exist.
Precisely, the paradigm of, let's say, everything declarative, the paradigm of ideal state versus current state, and how do you goal seek that, the idea of how do you extend those APIs to create operators on top of it, CRDs on top of it, just the sheer extensibility of and that's what I mean by elegance, right? That's the sort of beauty of the platform. It gave you an amazing solution, but it was also a solution which was the starting point, versus other solutions were the end all be all, sort of this is what I have, everything else you take care yourself.
So where does your company come into play with this?
So we are trying to solve precisely this problem. What we are essentially doing is creating that user space on top of the infrastructure. So built completely on top of open source ecosystems. We use Terraform, we use Kubernetes, we use Argo stack on top of it. And what we are essentially creating is one single user space where you connect your code base, you connect your cloud. We essentially bring you a no-nonsense build and no-nonsense deploy and a no-nonsense provision stack for you. And then you are free to extend it with any other CI, CD, any other CI or any other sort of, other solutions which can integrate onto that user space. So that's our objective. The genesis of the problem started primarily from the place that if you want to create a future-proof our infrastructure architecture, you need to have a learning curve of a lot of moving elements that power that underneath. And I do believe that at some point you have to learn how, let's say, Kubernetes works, how Terraform works, but that shouldn't be a barrier entry for people who want to go through the learning curve. I do believe that infrastructure investments currently are very reactive. And because of the reactiveness of investments, like you bring CI by the time your code is untestable, you bring out environments by the time you've essentially, not created a stateless app, you bring out provisioning by the time you've actually created a infrastructure which has a very, let's say, bespoke genesis. So that's the problem we are trying to solve. How to create a no nonsense code to cloud, I'd call it bridge instead of pipeline, where we provide you three basic functions: provisioning, build, deploy. Build powered by build packs and Docker. Deployment CD provided by Argo CD. Completely built on the principles of GitOps. So we don't take any custody of your code, of your data, of your config. We create this control plane within your cloud premises and check back all the infra and configuration files back into your Git providers.
So basically put the code in on the left, get it running on the cloud on the right.
Yep. As the starter pack, and then you take it from there. So as and when you are sort of, going deeper into your infrastructure stack, you're free to access your YAML files, power through them, and create that extra juice that you need. But when you get it working on day zero, you get it right the first time, which is a hard part to get.
This sounds very Heroku-like, if you will.
So essentially, two big sort of changes. One is we are essentially PaaS within your cloud premises, unlike Heroku, so you can extend it with other cloud native services almost seamlessly. And second is, for us, the unit of reasoning is not one particular application, but the whole environment. That's the sort of two design changes we are doing. I think the end user experience in our minds is clear what we want to provide.
And we didn't even say the company name. The company name is Amnic, AMNIC. We'll have all that contact information down in the show notes. But if people wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
Right now, we are working with a few limited sets of design partners, but we are happy to chat with as many people who want to try out the platform. We do have some sort of qualifying step right now because the platform is under development. Just drop a mail to hello@amnic.com or invite@amnic.com, and we can take the process from there.
I do want to bring up one more thing. You were talking about future-proofing. 10 years ago, you could not have future-proofed for Kubernetes. 10 years in the future, what are we not future-proofing for right now?
So that's a very interesting question. 10 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to think of a paradigm like, let's say, containerization, Kubernetes. 15 years ago, I couldn't have been able to think of, a cloud as a concept. So it's definitely, I think it will become a bit more prophesizing. In my mind, instrument and observability might be a place where, you might see a similar paradigm shift. Now, how, in what shape and form will that look like? I can't predict right now, but that's an area which is ripe for disruption. I don't know, the way sort of databases or the data part of it. I do believe that the data storage part has very different sort of, I'd say, paradigms and parameters. You have your relational database, you have a sort of a data at rest for large compute, then you have other data for timeline, linear timeline storage, you have another data store for real-time access. I do believe that all of this, which is sort of a fragmented experience, there might be a better paradigm, which might be data as a service or something. But I don't know. It's just a guesswork, I guess.
All right. Well, all of Ankit's contact information is going to be down in the show notes. Ankit, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Victor and Darian. It was great to interact with you guys.
We hope this episode was helpful to you. If you want to discuss it or ask a question, please reach out to us. Our contact information and a link to the Slack workspace are at devopsparadox.com/contact. If you subscribe through Apple Podcast, be sure to leave us a review there. That helps other people discover this podcast. Go sign up right now at devopsparadox.com to receive an email whenever we drop the latest episode. Thank you for listening to DevOps Paradox.